So with this cube selected, if we click on our material tab, we can press new to create a new material. And so now our cube has this generic white Blender render material just called material. We could go ahead and click and rename this something generic like my material or whatever, doesn't really matter. And in the last video, we went over what every one of these top set of buttons do, these menus. We talked about how this button right here gives you access to every single material that exists within the whole file. So if you had some other objects using different materials and you wanted to give this cube one of those other materials, you could click here and select from that. Of course, we only have this one cube and the one material right now. So go back and watch that video if you need a refresher on what all this stuff above here is. Down here, we have these 4 buttons display when we're using Blender Render for Blender Render materials. The default type is surface, but we have these 3 other types: wire, volume, and halo. As you can see, as I click on some of them, the actual presentation of the object will change. And we're going to discuss these other 3, wire, volume, and halo, and render a few things out in the next video. But for now, we're going to discuss the most commonly used material type setting for Blender Render materials, which is of course surface. First, I want to show you this preview menu. If we click this, this will give us a visual representation of what our material looks like. This menu can be occasionally helpful to get a basic idea of what your material looks like. It can be especially helpful for new users who aren't familiar with materials and such. However, it's not necessarily going to give you the exact feedback you're looking for. So typically I don't use this preview window. We'll go ahead and bring it up top here, and we will use it for the purposes of demonstrations in this video. But typically I don't use this because I get much better feedback just by coming down to my director's chair area and pressing the render preview button. Then I can see exactly how the material will look like when it's going to render, and on the actual objects and the surroundings and with the environment that I'm going to use it. So once you get used to using materials and adjusting settings and things, you can typically get a lot better feedback by using the render preview button down here in the director's chair menu, rather than leaving this preview menu open all the time, which can sort of slow your file down a little bit and isn't necessarily going to give you the feedback you're always looking for. But we'll go ahead and keep it open while we're learning about the basic properties of the material. Also, these menu items can occasionally be shuffled around. You can actually pick them up by these little dots and drag them wherever you want if you want to position things to your own liking. So if I go in an order that's not exactly the same as what you have on your machine, no big deal, just look for it in the list here. So starting off, we have Diffuse. And the Diffuse menu lets us control the basic surface hue or color of our material. So right now it's just this default white, but we could, select green or blue or make it pink or red or what have you. We can also control these individual RGB values here if we want. We can change this to HSV, which I use this a lot to adjust the saturation of the color. So typically I find RGB pretty useful to, find the color I'm looking for. And then HSV is nice for adjusting the saturation value there, depending on whatever you're going for. Next here, we have the shader model type. And these are basically different ways in which this diffuse surface, color surface can be represented. And so there's various options here you may want to toy around with. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and create a few more objects so we can get a better idea of what's going on with our material. So I'm going to double right click over here and under mesh, add a monkey. Press W a couple of times to smooth it out, press S to scale, and I'll double right click over here and let's add a UV sphere and press W a few times to smooth that up. And then maybe up top here, we'll add a torus shape, press W to give that some smoothing, G to grab, S to scale. So we have a few more objects, maybe bring that down to work with here. Okay, so if I click on this Suzanne head here, which has no materials on it, if we remember from the last video, this button here will give us access to every single material that exists in the whole file. Whereas this box up here lets us know what materials does that particular object have, which the Suzanne head has no materials. But we can give this Suzanne head this material that we created on this cube by clicking this and selecting My Material. And we could do this for each one of these other objects. But a much faster way is to use the ZeroBrush Options menu to distribute materials. So we could select this object, shift select this one, press Q to bring up our ZeroBrush options, And so if you have the full version of ZeroBrush, there's going to be a bit more options displayed here. But whether you're using ZeroBrush or ZeroBrush Lite, you should see this material options here. And under Assign Material, we can click on My Material, and this will distribute the material we created for the cube to these other two objects. So now this My Material that we created exists on all four of these objects. So any change we make to the material existing on one object, such as the darkness here or the color or what have you, is going to be reflected on the rest of them. In the previous video, we also talked about users and fake users and a little bit about the way Blender handles saving materials. Notice this value 4 next to where it says My Material, because this material has 4 users: the cube, the torus, the sphere, and the monkey head. If I were to click any one of these objects and press Q, and under Material Options, press Remove Materials, and then click back on one of the objects using that material, notice it says 3 because there's only 3 users. I'll go ahead and click back on here, and under Assign Material, make sure it's using that material as well. So here in the Diffuse menu here, where we can adjust the color of our material, we also have this intensity value we can use. And then we have this ramp value, which this will allow us to use 2 or even more colors to gradient across our object, which is pretty cool. So if I were to press ramp. So notice here in the 3D view that we are actually in solid viewport shading, which while in Blender render mode will let us see basically what color the material is, but that's about it. So when you're dealing with materials, typically you want to be in material viewport shading, and this lets us see a lot more of the actual properties being used on our material, though not everything. For instance, if we were to use mirror and increase the reflectivity, we're not going to get a live update of the way things are reflecting onto other things. But in general, we will get a lot more feedback than if we were in solid viewport shading. So you can change that down here, or of course you can just press Alt-Z to switch out between those. Of course, down here in the camera area, this screen is always kept in material viewport shading to give us the closest possible representation of our final rendered image as we can get without actually pressing our render preview button or doing an actual render. So with this ramp value, we have these 2 different sliders. And this row of information down here is regarding this little kind of crayon looking marker thing here. And we can tell that this one is the active one because if you look real close, it's got these little dotted lines on top of it. So you can see I'm actually moving this. It's adjusting that position value. And this is its color. So we could click here. We could change this to something else, say green or something like that. Of course, we can't really see the green much because the transparency value, the alpha value here, is set to 0, which means it's invisible basically. So if we brought that all the way back to full, we now have this gradient between green and white. So the cool thing about setting this alpha value here, this transparency, is that we can have this ramp working on top of our diffuse color here, which is what was going on before. So if we were to bring that alpha value down and click on this other marker, and once again we can tell it's active because it's got the little dotted lines on top of it now, and bring its alpha value down too, we're still seeing the underlying diffuse color under there with this gradient on top. Whereas if we just wanted to see the gradient, we'd bring these alpha values all the way up to 1 for both of these. And then however we change these colors, will be what we get here. So I could click on this one, I could bring this up, and we get this kind of half blue, half kind of lime green, weird kind of color. And we can add more sliders to this by pressing this plus button here, and this will give us another generic slider. We can move this over. And so you can see real quickly we start getting some pretty interesting results with these color ramps. So yeah, that's pretty crazy looking. Below this bar of information, which is letting us control whichever one of these markers we happen to have selected, we have some more information here, such as the input you can change, and then the blend mode. And that's basically referring to the blend mode of this ramp with the default diffuse color here. And right now it's set to mix. And if you're familiar with like Photoshop or GIMP, you might be familiar with what some of these blend modes mean, such as overlay. And now we can see this kind of ramp color overlaid over this diffuse color here, or multiply, which makes it a bit darker, or subtract, which will basically give us the inverse of the colors, and so on, just so you're aware of that. So yeah, we can do some really sweet stuff with these ramp values. And the ramp value will show up in a bunch of different things in Blender, not just this diffuse menu of materials. You'll find it show up in several other areas. Then finally under here we have this factor value. This is going to be the overall control between these ramp colors and this basic diffuse. So if we brought that all the way down to 0, basically no effect on the default diffuse color, and then we can control that there, which is pretty cool. We can actually animate most, if not all, of these values, which is always awesome. So for instance, with my timeline back to 0 here, if I were to press I over this to insert a keyframe for it, and because all of these objects here are using this material, they will all show up here in the timeline. And if I were to right click and drag this down to say 5 seconds or so, and then bring this factor all the way up to 1 and press I again to insert another keyframe, press back. We'll now have this ramp value animating here. However, it's not showing up during the live view, but it is something that will render out. So for instance, if I were to come down here and drop this to say 25% or something, so we can see this much smaller, and set the end length of my animation here to 150 frames rather than 600, so that will be all that renders out, and press render animation and let that finish up there. And then so far to come down here and press play animation, we can now see the results of animating that factor value of the ramp here in our animation. So yeah, you can animate most of these properties. Sometimes it's a bit difficult for Blender to live update them as you're playing the animation back. So you may have to do like a test render animation like this to actually see the results, but you know, they will work. I'll click X to get rid of the Blender's animation player there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and press go back here, and I'm going to press X to delete all those keyframes, press back, and I'm going to go ahead and disable the ramp as we move forward, so we can kind of discuss some more of the basic properties of the Blender render material. So next up here we have subsurface scattering, and this is another one of those options, as are most of these options with the exception of some transparency options. These are things that are only going to show up when you render, and there are also options that are going to probably significantly increase your render times if you're doing Blender render renders. So if we were to turn on subsurface scattering here, we can see all of its options. And subsurface scattering tries to emulate the natural effect of light not only hitting a surface, but oftentimes being absorbed by a surface, bouncing around within some layers of that surface, and then coming back out. So this can help emulate things like human skin, eggs, jello, that sort of thing, wherein light comes in and then bounces around to make things look more organic. So we've got a bunch of different settings here we're not going to really get into, but there are some sweet presets here such as apple, chicken, cream, skin 1, skin 2, etc. So for instance, if we were to change this to skin 2 here, we can see a little bit of a representation in the preview material, but not great. We can actually change the way these materials are previewed by clicking these objects here. Sometimes this can help a bit, so we could click the Suzanne head, maybe get a bit of a better idea. However, this is one of those instances where the default preview menu isn't super helpful here, so that's why it's really nice to use this camera area down here as a way to test materials. So we could press our render preview button, and we can see much more in this version here of the kind of soft gelatin kind of look. So we could change this to, say, skim milk. Say, change this color to something more skin looking, or, well, at least vaguely more skin looking, and press the render preview button here. This gives us a little better example of the softness that the subsurface scattering can produce. Plenty of stuff to toy around with here. So we'll go ahead and click this back up and turn that off, and let's turn on transparency and go ahead and open that up. So before going over the transparency options, let's go ahead and build a little bit of a background so we can see the way these materials are reflecting on things. So I'll press Shift-C to recenter my cursor, press Shift-A and under Mesh, add a plane, S to scale like this. And I'm going to go ahead and Shift select all of these and just bring them to where they're sitting, maybe on top of this stuff here, rather than just sort of floating. Just 4 to go into right view, R to rotate. Just kind of have this Suzanne head sitting here. And maybe bring this down. And then I'm going to go ahead and scale this out a little bit. I'm going to press T to bring up my tool shelf. Under physics control, I'm going to press add passive. And I'm going to double right click over here, add a cube. And I'm going to press Shift D to add an array modifier, then Alt Shift D. And then I'm going to keep pressing Alt Shift D until I see this thing stacking upwards like this. And then press Shift D some more to increase it. And press add active, and then press separate. And I'm going to press Alt D to do a link duplicate of this a couple of times. Then I'm going to press B to do a border select, and R to rotate these in some random direction, just so these will fall around and give us some scenery here. And then let's press play, and these all fall wherever. That's fine. Press pause there. And maybe just get rid of the ones that are touching the actual materials. Shift select those, X to delete. Okay, just so we have a little bit of stuff scattered around so we can examine these materials a bit better. So I'll press T to dismiss my tool shelves. Some aspects of the transparency can actually be used and seen in the live 3D view, whereas some aspects will only show up if rendering. So sort of from the left to the right here, we have the least resource intensive methods of transparency, getting to the more and more involved ones. So if we click this to mask, this will mask the background over the objects with this alpha value. So if we leave this alpha value at 1, come down here and press our render preview button, it doesn't appear that any of the objects using our material here are transparent. We click that to stop it. But if we bring this alpha value down, we can both see these objects being transparent live in the 3D view, and also if we press the render preview button, we'll also see their transparency here. So yeah, when rendering with the mask value isn't going to actually show any of the background, so it's only transparent in the sense with the mask value of the material itself and not really letting you see through things. But if we pause this and switch this over to Z transparency, we can also see this live in the 3D view, but if we press our render preview button, we'll actually see this when rendering as well. We can lower this alpha value. We can increase this Fresnel, which Fresnel is a method of blending. So if we bring this Fresnel up and increase the blend here a bit, we can adjust some more dimensions of this transparency, which is pretty sweet. Increasing this blend value, we get more and more transparency towards the center and less towards the edges. But mostly these values are only going to affect when we're rendering or render previewing. So I'll click here to turn that off. Under here we have this specular value, which specularity basically means shininess. So this value lets us control the alpha or transparency value of the specular basically. So if I zoom in upon this Suzanne monkey's eyes here, and I press the render preview button, we can see a lot of the shininess of the eyes there. But if we bring the specular value down to 0, notice that all goes away. I'll press my render preview button to stop that. Finally, to the far right, we have the most resource heavy and the best looking option of ray trace. So the ray tracing can be used to create much more realistic looking glass and stuff like that, adjusting this IOR value, which stands for index of refraction, which different values will give you different type of glass effects basically. So with the ray trace on, if we were to press render preview, we get a much more realistic ray traced glass effect with our transparency. So we could adjust this index of refraction value here to get different type of glass effects, control how much gloss is going on here. So this will sort of blend the gloss effect, but of course, as soon as you take this down, it's going to be a lot more resource heavy in terms of rendering. And the samples control how good is this lack of total glossiness going to look, basically. Then you have depth, which is not actually referring to how deep does the effect go within the object. What depth means is how many times should one material bounce off on another, then bounce back so that they are affected. So right now it's set to about 2, but if we increase that, we'll get a bit more of a realistic simulation, but it's going to cost more resources. And the depth value will become much more apparent when we explain what it is in the mirror value. So we've got these various settings here, like we did with the Z transparency, the Fresnel, the amount that this should be blended, what have you. So between these different effects, we can create different kind of glass, mirrory, foggy, kind of reflective, things like that. So I'll go ahead and turn off my render preview button. So if we close up our transparency setting, go ahead and turn that off and turn on mirror. And of course, the mirror effects are only going to show up when we are rendering. So right now with this set to mirror and the reflectivity we have turned up, make sure it's not at 0 or it's not going to do anything. So if we bring this all the way up to 1, it's going to be total reflection, and that means that none of the material's color will show up. So if we press render preview, it's total Terminator 2 style reflection chrome almost here. And I was talking about that depth value. What that refers to is how many times do things bounce off each other. So for instance, if we come down here and we try to kind of zoom in on this side of this cube here, we can see the cube is reflecting this Suzanne head. But if we decrease the depth to 1, notice how this value changes. And actually we are getting some amount of the color showing through because of the amount of depth. But notice if we set this all the way down to 0, the material will only be bouncing off of itself one time, which means because it's doing that, it's not actually doing a full loop of the reflection process, which is why we're actually able to see the actual original color of the Suzanne head in the cube here. But as you can see, the more we increase this, the more times reflection will happen inside a reflection will happen inside a reflection, basically. Let's go ahead and turn that off and also turn on ambient occlusion, because reflection effects look a lot better with ambient occlusion going on here in Blender Render. All right, press that to turn that off for now. So we have the Fresnel like we did with the transparency, and as soon as we increase that up, we have this blend value. I'll zoom in a little here. And so if we increase this blend value, notice now we're getting a lot more of the original diffuse color in there because it's blending with the reflection so that the reflection is not just so hardcore controlling. And actually, if we decrease this gloss value, this is what's going to actually create the kind of frosty effect. And of course, immediately cost a lot more resources. So we could turn this gloss way down. Pretty much the lower we make this gloss value, the more resources are going to have to be used for this to look decent, or else it's going to start looking really noisy unless we increase these samples a lot. If I pause that for now, and I'll go ahead and turn ambient occlusion off, because with the ambient occlusion plus the lack of gloss is making it bog down quite a bit. But if I come over here and press my render preview button, we can see how we get a much more blended effect of this reflectivity, but it's got a lot more work to do. And I forgot to mention this max distance value. This is talking about the depth here. This is saying how far should something be away before I include it in my bounce off reflection, basically. So if it's set to 0, it's going to bounce off reflect anything that exists, no matter how far away or how close. So I could press that to turn that off, and we could increase this gloss back up to 1 and get rid of the Fresnel. And so if we press render preview now, everything looks basically chromy. But if I were to put an actual value on this max distance, such as 0.1, notice that we're not seeing reflections of anything because it's only accepting reflecting stuff if it's like 0.1 units away, which is not very far. Of course, the more we increase this, the more its radius will increase enough that it will accept reflections from other existing things. You can see more and more stuff coming into focus in that sphere there as I increase this. All right, so I'll go ahead and pause that. So I'll go ahead and turn off the mirror. And this custom properties, this is basically for getting more advanced stuff, scripting and things like that. Sometimes various add-ons will use custom properties. So we'll close that up. Moving on to shadow. This controls how and if an object should receive shadows. So for instance, if I were to select this cube, press G to grab, and bring it over here to where this cube is kind of casting a shadow onto the Suzanne head here, and just kind of get over there. So we can see the edge of this cube's shadow going on to Suzanne here. But if we turn off receive and press our render preview button, notice that the head is not receiving any shadows, even though everything else in the scene, there's still shadows. So we can control whether or not objects with those materials receive shadows. That's how we can do that. Or we can just switch this to show shadows only, basically, show nothing but the shadows. So if I were to press render preview there, we'll see nothing but the shadows of everything else via this material. Not sure why you would want that, but maybe you would for something. And we'll turn receive back on. So I think you get the basic gist of this. So we can control whether or not the material is casting, whether they're receiving, and then various options for that. And so I'll close that up. Moving on, we have specular. This is a really basic, important one. The specular value, as I mentioned several times before, is basically referring to the shininess. And notice right now that the shininess is white, but we could change this color to be like blue or red or anything like that. And of course, specular values are only going to show up where actual light is facing towards them. So by default in Sensei format, we keep our basic scene lamp here, which is actually composed of 2 different lamps for a specific reason. We keep the visibility of it hidden in the 3D view, whereas we keep its renderability active. So whenever we're doing a render preview or go to render our scene, we'll get this default lighting set up. But if you click on the eye value, this will then display this lamp. And however we move this lamp around is going to change where the specular values display, because the specular values is referring to the shininess. So if I press G to grab and press R to rotate, notice that in addition to the position of the shadows changing, we're seeing the position of the specularity of the objects change also. That's the first thing to keep in mind about specular values. They're only going to show up where light is hitting them. So I'll go ahead and move that back up and click on this eye icon to hide it because I don't like looking at it when I don't need it. So if we click back on any one of these objects using our little material here, typically it's best to keep your specular value to white, and you can always get back to white with a color slider by dragging these RGB all to 1. And because that's typically most things reflect back white light like this. Then we have some various options in the same way we have for our diffuse, our basic color settings here, which can, produce different effects, but we'll put that back on Cook Tour. Then we can control the intensity. Notice if we bring the intensity all the way down, that the objects look very flat because that's their shininess level. We can increase it up a bunch. Hardness is going to control the distribution of the specularity, basically. So if we bring the hardness super low, it's going to be super scattered over the whole object. If we make the hardness really tight, the surface will look much harder and much shinier. So basically, the more we bring this up, the more things look like a bowling ball. Now, specularity is also very often controlled via texture maps, which we're going to get into that in a video soon to come. Okay, so moving on down to shading here. So shading is referring to, in conjunction with the material itself, how is the geometry, the mesh of the object affecting the way this material displays. And we also use this emit value in the shading to control light emission or glowing. So if we were to increase this emit value, notice that these get much more glowy. In Blender Render, adjusting this emit value on its own will not actually cause these objects to emit light onto objects surrounding them. So even if we were to come down here and press our render preview button, this light's not going to be bouncing off onto any of these other objects. But if we click on our World tab, which lets us control a lot of environmental settings, and turn on Indirect Lighting, and then under Gather, switch this to Approximate, and if we come down here and press our Render Preview button, we can actually see the light being emitted off of our objects with this same material onto these other objects. It'd be a little easier to see if we click on this lights value and drop this down to 0, and now if we press the Render Preview button, we'll see nothing but the emitted light from the objects with this material onto the objects that are near them. And so this is how we get things to glow and work if we're rendering in Blender Render. So I'll press this to turn that off. So I'll go ahead and come down here back on lights and turn my scene brightness back up to around where it was. And I'm going to turn off indirect lighting and click back on my material tab with one of these objects with the same material selected so we can get to these settings. And let's turn this emission value back to 0. This ambient value here affects how much ambience will be used on an object if you are using ambient occlusion in your Blender render scene. So right now, we could drop this value down to 0 and press render preview. And we're not going to see much of a difference between the objects with this material and the objects without it. But if we turn on ambient occlusion and notice that everything will have ambient occlusion, but with this value down to 0, if we press render preview, these guys look like they're not using any ambient occlusion at all, whereas everything else around them indeed is getting that ambient occlusion effect. So if we were to increase this ambient back up to 1, notice that we'll see all the nice dark ambient effect on the material. So this translucence value, this is also going to affect the shading created from the actual geometry of the mesh, how much it shows up or not. So we could, bring this all the way up to 1. And notice now that we're not seeing much of the shading at all produced from the actual geometry of the objects almost at all. So then we have shadeless. This means that the geometry of the object using that material won't affect the material at all. So if we press shadeless, notice it basically looks now like a flat 2D image here. So if we were to press our render preview button, it just looks totally flat and we're just getting the material itself and not any of the effects that would be generated from the geometry of the actual object with the material. Turn render preview off. The next two options are tangent shading. This is typically what we use if we're using a material on particle hair in Blender render. And then cubic interpolation can help with giving us smoother transitions, apparently. I didn't know what it meant, but that's what it says here. Used for diffuse values for smoother transitions. Speaking of particle hair, under strand here, these are settings if we're using a material on particle hair. So these will basically control the root, the beginning of the particle hair, how thin should the tip be. So for instance, we could switch our preview display to this particle thing here, and we can actually kind of see kind of a representation of that. I'm going to turn this hardness value down on the specularity. So if we have the root real big and the tip super small, we can see that sort of changing up there. We can drag this down a little bit to make that a little bit bigger. So we can see how that's changing the thickness of the tip there. And so if we had an actual particle system, this strand options would be changing the way our particle hair looked, as you can see here. Finally, under options here, we have various options to adjust the way the material will work with the environment, the rest of the scene, mist, things like should vertex color paint show up if you had, say, been in vertex paint mode and switch this to solid viewport shading so you can actually see the vertex paint. So it's like saying things like, should this show up when I render? If this is not on, if we press render preview, the answer will be no. However, if I activate that, and we press render preview button, we will see our actual vertex paint that we put onto the object. So various things like that. So that about wraps us up for a basic introduction to Blender render materials. We will also be covering a little bit on Blender render textures, UV mapping, and that sort of thing before we finally move on to cycles materials and cycles rendering. So thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.